Sergeant Idris Vale was awake because sleep had turned unreliable 3 deployments ago. It wasn't the noise that kept him from resting. It was the quality of the silence. In a hostile, urban sector, true silence meant someone was holding their breath. The combat outpost generator coughed, a thick cloud of diesel exhaust into the night air, its rhythmic thrum vibrating through the plywood floorboards of the barracks. Above him, the harsh, white fluorescent lights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the rows of cots. Someone outside muttered in a dreamer, jagged, consonant-heavy plea that cut off as quickly as it began. Vale lay on his narrow cot, staring at the corrugated metal ceiling, tracing the rust patterns he had memorized over the last 7 months. He was waiting. He didn't know what for, but his body was strung tight with the anticipation of it. When the plywood door finally pushed open, scraping against the uneven floor, Vale didn't flinch. "Thermal anomaly," the operations runner said. He was young, his helmet too big for his head, out of breath from sprinting across the gravel courtyard. Repeated, "Sector Green 9. Vale sat up, the springs of his cot groaning in protest. He rubbed the grit from his eyes. "I'd team." Negative, Rooftop. That got his attention. IEDs were ground-level problems. Rooftops were a different language, entirely snipers, spotters, or mortar teams preparing to drop steel rain on the compound within 10 minutes. Vale was fully dressed, boots laced tight, and standing inside the plywood operations shack. The room was bathed in the red glow of tactical lighting, designed to preserve their night vision. It smelled of stale coffee, ozone from the overheated servers, and the sharp temps of anxious sweat. The drone feed flickered on the primary screener, massive, high-definition monitor that dominated the far wall. It displayed grainy infrared imagery over a dense, chaotic grid of concrete buildings. Sector Green 9 was a labyrinth. Flat roofs stretched out like a patchwork quilt of grey and white heat signatures. The camera panned over satellite dishes that looked like hollow bowls, cylindrical water tanks, and laundry lines strung between air conditioning units, stiff in the night air. "There," said Specialist Corin Hale. The drone operator leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against the edge of the monitor. Hale was a ghost of a man, pale from spending 12 hours a day in this dark room, his eyes forever fixed on the sky's perspective. A brief pulse of light bloomed white-hot on the screen, a perfect, blinding circle of thermal energy, and then vanished. "Again," Hale said, his voice flat. They waited. The seconds ticked by, heavy and slow. Vale counted them in his head. 3 buildings over, another flash. Same intensity, same duration. It was a sharp, aggressive spike of light that left a ghost image on the retina even through the digital feed. Lieutenant Mara Ionescu stood by the comms console, her arms folded across her chest. She was a master tactician, someone who viewed the city not as a place where people lived, but as a chessboard of sight lines and choke points. She didn't fidget when she was thinking. She went completely still, like a held breath, signal. She asked, her eyes never leaving the screen. Hale zoomed the camera slightly, the pixels momentarily blurring before sharpening into terrifying clarity. "Looks deliberate. Angles wrong for a reflection. There's no ambient light source down there strong enough to bounce back like that, anyway. The moon is obscured by cloud cover. Frequency?" Vale asked, stepping closer to the glass. "Every 90 seconds. "Precisely," Hale replied, tapping his keyboard to bring up a timing log. "But not the same rooftop. As if on cue, they watched another pulse bloom, this time 2 blocks further north. It was a tiny, brilliant star born and dying in a fraction of a second. Leapfrogging, Ionescu murmured, her brow furrowed in the red light. Vale leaned closer, his nose almost touching the monitor. Sector Green 9 was a knot of tight winding alleys and 4-story cement boxes stacked practically on top of one another. Balconies were caged in rusted rebar to keep thieves out, maybe to keep the residents in. It was a neighborhood that swallowed armored vehicles whole and trapped men in lethal 3-dimensional crossfires. If you were on the street, you could be shot from 200 different windows before you even knew you were taking fire. Could be kids with mirrors, Hale offered, though he didn't sound convinced. Playing around with a laser pointer or a scavenged strobe. At 2 in the morning, Vale said, his voice a low rumble. In a curfew zone where anyone caught outside is treated as a combatant. The next flash came. Hale checked the timer. Precisely 90 seconds later. Not kids, Ionescu said. Too consistent. That is military precision. Mechanical timing. Vale exhaled slowly, feeling the familiar, cold knot tighten in his gut. Insurgent comes. Maybe, she said, or spotters marking movement. Finding the highest points, plotting lines of sight. Pull up the route overlay, Vale said. Hale hit a key. A thick blue line superimposed itself over the thermal map. They checked the grid. The flashes weren't random. They formed a rough, jagged arc curving deliberately toward the main supply route. The artery that kept their outpost alive. Vale felt the weight of the realization settle heavily in his chest. A massive supply convoy was scheduled to roll through that exact route at dawn by 3:05. The squad was geared up and standing by the blast doors. Vale's team wasn't large at total, counting him. They were a specialized element, designed for quick, quiet insertions. They didn't do grand assaults. They did the surgical work in the dark. They moved quietly, methodically. There were no dramatic speeches, no bravado. The reality of urban combat had long ago stripped them of any Hollywood illusions. Corporal Nader Resnick stood by the reinforced gate, checking his radio frequency for the second time. Resnick was a cynic, a man who survived by expecting the worst from every shadow. He tapped the side of his helmet, confirming the encrypted link with the operations center, before stepping into the staging area. Private Salam Okoye was beside him, meticulously tightening the sling of her rifle. She adjusted a strip of black tape around her wrist. It was a nervous habit she'd picked up after her first firefighter grounding mechanism to steady her pulse when the adrenaline threatened to drown her. She was the youngest of the group, but her eyes held the flat, hard stare of a veteran. Specialist Bram Kessler stood in the back, adjusting the straps of the compact telescoping ladder system slung across his back. Kessler was a brilliant engineer and a reliable shot, but he had a secret. He hated heights. He despised the vertiginous drops of the city, the precarious ledges, the feeling of empty air beneath his boots. Nobody in the squad ever mentioned it. They just trusted him to climb when told, "We're green." Vale said over the squad net. They stepped into the alley in a staggered, silent formation. The air outside the compound smelled like warm dust, raw sewage, and diesel. Even at night, the city held its heat, radiating upward from the cracked asphalt. Somewhere in the distance, a civilian generator hummed, a low, desperate vibration. A feral dog barked once, sharply, and then stopped as if realizing the danger of making noise. Back in the operations shack, Hale stayed glued to his monitors. Their eye in the sky. Flash expected in 30 seconds. Hale's voice whispered through their earpieces, startlingly clear against the ambient noise of the city. Vale raised a gloved hand, extending 2 fingers. The squad halted instantly, melting into the deep shadow of a shuttered storefront. The metal grate against their backs was still warm. They waited. The silence was heavy, suffocating. There are 3 blocks ahead, silhouetted against the hazy, light-polluted skyliner. Pulse of blinding white flared and died. Building matches, grid marker, Fortune Delta. Hale reported over the net. Vale scanned the street through his night vision goggles. The world was washed in an eerie, glowing green. There was no movement at street level. Trash blew lazily across the pavement. The windows of the target building were black, unblinking eyes. "Approach quiet," Vale murmured. They moved. Urban movement wasn't cinematic. It wasn't about running and gunning. It was slow, terrifying geometry. It was about angles, shadows, doorways, and calculating lines of fire. Every intersection was a gamble with a sniper's crosshairs. Every pile of garbage could conceal an improvised explosive device. They moved like water flowing through a jagged riverbed, fluid but cautious, covering one another with practiced, silent coordination. They reached the base of the first building 5 minutes later. It was a 4-story structure, the concrete facade cracked and peeling from years of intense summer heat and neglect. The front entrance was a heavy metal door, secured by a surprisingly simple mechanical latch. "Thermal," Vale whispered into his mic. "Cold inside," Hale replied immediately. "No visible hostiles on the scanners. Heat signatures indicate standard residential occupation. People sleeping." "Visible," Resnick muttered darkly over the local net. "Meaning the ones we can't see are the ones waiting for us." Vale ignored him. He tested the metal latch with a gloved hand. It opened without resistance, swinging inward on silent hinges. Inside, the stairwell was suffocatingly dark. It smelled intensely of cumin, old cooking oil, and the damp, earthy scent of aging stone. Vale motioned upward with the barrel of his rifle. They began the climb. Each step seemed to groan under their combined weight, the sound echoing upward like a gunshot in the confined space. They hugged the walls, rifles trained on the dark landings above. Halfway up the second flight, a baby began crying behind one of the thin, wooden apartment doors. It was a sharp, wailing sound, full of genuine distress. The sound cut through the silence like a knife. Okoye's jaw tightened, her rifle wavering just a fraction of an inch. Vale saw it, but didn't say anything. The sound of crying children was the soundtrack of this war, a constant reminder of the lives they were disrupting, the terror they brought just by existing in these hallways. Vale paused at the final landing leading to the roof access door. He pressed 2 fingers to his helmet, signaling the squad to ready themselves. He counted down from 3 with his fingers. On 1, Resnick pushed the door open. They flooded the roof, sweeping their barrels left, right, and center. Cutting through the darkness, empty, the roof was a graveyard of domestic life. A rusted satellite dish pointed blindly at the sky. 2 cracked plastic chairs sat beside a makeshift table made from a wooden pallet. A massive, galvanized water tank hummed faintly. There was no signal device, no complex wiring, no mirrors, no strobes, no insurgents. "Negative contact," Vale whispered. Lowering his weapon slightly, the flash was there. Sergeant Hale insisted over the comms, his voice tinged with frustration. Exact coordinates. I logged the thermal bloom right where you're standing. Resnick knelt by the edge of the roof, scanning the neighboring structures through the thermal optic mounted on his rifle. Maybe they moved, hoffed the gap before we cleared the stairs. No time for debate. Lieutenant Ionescu's voice cut in, sharp and authoritative. She was operating from a mobile command vehicle 2 blocks south, coordinating the wider net. Next pulse in 45 seconds. Track it. If they are moving fast. They crouched low behind a low parapet wall, making themselves as small as possible. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of ozone. 40-5 seconds stretched into an eternity. Then 2 buildings to the eastern, the brilliant flash illuminated the smoggy sky. Shift. Vale ordered Kessler move to the edge of the roof, unlimbering the compact ladder system. With a soft, metallic bite, the hooks caught the edge of the adjacent roof. The gap was wider 4-story drop into a concrete alley below. Kessler didn't look down. He locked his jaw, tested the tension, and nodded. They crossed the gap, one at a time, moving quickly but carefully, balancing the heavy weight of their armor and weapons. The metal rungs groaned under their boots. The second rooftop was equally barren. More laundry, more water tanks. No people. No devices. Again, Hale said, his voice tightening. Northwest now. Distance, 60 meters. This time, the flash came from a lower building, only 3 stories high, set back from the main street. The angle was entirely wrong for easy rooftop hopping. They couldn't bridge it. We go down and around, Vale said, frustration creeping into his tone. They descended the stairs of the second building, plunging back into the oppressive heat of the street level. It felt tighter now. The shadows seemed deeper. The black windows above felt less empty and more like watching eyes. The silence was beginning to feel hostile. They reached the exterior of the third building just as the 90-second mark approached. They stacked up against the wall, out of the moonlight. Hold, Vale whispered. They watched the dark roofline, waiting for the telltale starburst of light. Nothing. The darkness remained, unbroken. The seconds ticked past. 10, 20, 30 seconds past the 90-second mark. Missed cycle. Okoye breathed, wiping a bead of sweat from her eye. Did they spot us? Wait, Hale said sharply over the net. I have a thermal spike. But it's... The flash came, but it didn't come from the roof. It came from a second-story window. Vale froze. The entire squad tensed, rifles snapping upward, tracing the origin of the light. That's not a rooftop, Resnick said, his voice a tight hiss through his night vision optics. Vale watched as a heavy, dark curtain inside the window shifted slightly, falling back into place. Vale felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Something was deeply off pattern. The rhythm was right, but the execution was wrong. Tactical units didn't suddenly abandon high ground visibility to signal from a restricted window frame. It defied military logic. Thermal. Vale whispered urgently, scanning. Multiple heat signatures inside the room, Hale replied, the rapid clicking of his keyboard bleeding over the mic. Small clusters, consistent with a family. 2 adults, maybe 3 children. Huddled together, the curtain shifted again. Another pulse of light erupted from the window weaker. This time, as if the battery was dying or the source was being partially obscured, but it wasn't shining outward, toward the supply route. It was angled upward, It wasn't signaling across the rooftops to other spotters. It was signaling into the sky, toward the clouds, toward the drone. Vale understood before anyone else said it out loud. Someone wasn't coordinating an attack. Someone was desperately trying to be seen by the very eye in the sky they were using to hunt them. "Lieutenant," Vale murmured, pressing his mic. "Hold up. This isn't spotter comes." Silence on the line. INSQ was processing. "Explain, Sergeant." "The flashes are repositioning, but not with tactical spacing. They went from roof to roof, and now they've retreated to a window." "It's not leapfrogging." He watched the window, waiting for the next pulse. "It's like someone was trying different angles to get past the cloud cover, to get our attention. Signal pattern is still 90 seconds. Hale added, though he sounded less certain now. "Consistent timing. Insurgents can use civilians." "Vale," INSQ said carefully. Her voice was cold, a reminder of the brutal reality of their environment. "They take over homes. They force families to act as cover while they operate. You know this." "Yes," Vale agreed, the memory of a dozen similar, bloody encounters flashing through his mind. "They can." Another flash from the window, fainter still. A sputtering plea in the dark. Okoye lowered her rifle a fraction of an inch. "That's not high-output military gear. That's handheld, like a scavenged rescue strobe or a high-lumen flashlight." Resnick shifted his weight uneasily, his boots grinding softly against the pavement. "Or it's a test. They're baiting us, trying to see if we'll investigate a civilian anomaly so they can hit us when we breach the door." Vale studied the building for It looked perfectly ordinary. The heavy wooden door at street level hung slightly crooked on its hinges. There was no external security, no reinforced barricades, no tripwires that he could see. A string of children's laundry, pale and ghost-like, hung between the second-story balconies. It was normal, almost too normal. Convoy rolls in less than 3 hours. INSQ reminded them, the pressure evident in her tone. That route must be secure. If this is targeting, if this is an IED trigger or an ambush coordination point, we neutralize it. Now, neutralize. The word echoed in Vale's earpiece. Usually, it was a clinical, comforting word. It meant solving a problem with overwhelming, precise violence. Tonight, looking at the tattered curtain of a second-story window, the word felt heavier. It felt like a mistake waiting to happen. Vale keyed his mic, making a decision that could end his career or end his life. Request hold on escalation. Sergeant INSQ warned. You think it's not hostile? I think we don't know. And don't know in a building full of thermal signatures means we're walking into a slaughter. One way or another. The window flickered again, a short, frantic burst, out of sync with the 90-second timer. Then, absolute darkness. They waited for the next interval. 90 seconds passed. Then 2 minutes. Nothing. The building was a tomb. Lost signal, Hale reported. No thermal spikes. Movement inside the room has ceased. Vale exhaled slowly, his breath fogging the inside of his protective glasses. Options? INSQ asked, the clock ticking audibly in her voice. Resnick answered before Vale could. Standard operating procedure. We clear the building, flashbang the entry, secure the occupants, detain the military-aged males, and question them. Tear the place apart until we find the light source. Standard, clean, efficient, and violent. Vale looked at the dark window. if heavily armed insurgents were waiting inside. Setting an ambush, speed and aggression mattered. You hit them before they hit you. But if a terrified family was inside, huddled in the dark, praying the monsters outside would pass them by, speed also mattered, but differently. A flashbang tossed into a room with toddlers didn't neutralize a threat. It created a tragedy that would haunt the squad forever. He pictured the stairwell from the first building, the smell of cumin, the crying baby, the paper-thin walls that wouldn't stop a 5.56 round. Urban combat was rarely about the mechanics of shooting. Any recruit could pull a trigger. The true burden of this war was about deciding when not to. Lieutenant Vale said quietly, his voice perfectly steady. Request permission to investigate low visibility. Soft entry. No forced breach unless we take fire or confirm hostile intent. The silence that followed was agonizing. Vale could almost hear Ionescu calculating the risk matrix in her head. Then, approved. But you are on a razor's edge, Vale. You have 15 minutes to secure that building and report back. If they twitch, you take them down. Vale signaled the team with sharp, precise hand gestures. Resnick, hold rear security at the alley mouth. Watch the high angles. Okoye, you're with me on the door. Kessler, keep the ladder ready. Stay on the street. Cover the second-story egress in case someone tries to jump. They moved out of the shadows. Vale and Okoye approached the crooked wooden door. Vale didn't kick it. He didn't order Okoye to plant a breaching charge. He raised his gloved hand and knocked. Once, firmly, no answer. The silence from within was absolute. He knocked again, louder this time. American military, he called out in heavily accented, broken local dialect. Open the door. He heard it then. The unmistakable sound of bare feet shuffling against a tile floor inside. The click of a deadbolt sliding back. Slow and hesitant. A woman's voice, dense, hushed, trembling with barely suppressed panic, murmured something unintelligible from the other side. The door creaked open, just a crack. Vale shifted his stance, lowering the barrel of his rifle slightly so it wasn't pointed directly at the sliver of darkness. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story, her politics, or what she had endured in the years since the city became a war zone. But as the door opened an inch further, illuminated by the ambient glow of the street lamp at the corner, he saw her hand gripping the edge of the wood. Her knuckles were white. She was trembling so violently the door vibrated against its hinges. Through the crack, he saw her eyes. They flicked wildly from Vale's masked face to his weapon, and then, inexorably, upward, toward the sky. For a terrible, prolonged moment, the raw, animal fear in her eyes hardened into something entirely different. It wasn't the defiant guilt of an insurgent caught in the act. It wasn't the blank terror of a bystander. It was absolute, crushing desperation. She stepped back, pulling the door open wider. Behind her, swallowed by the gloom of the unlit hallway, two small children stood frozen, watching the heavily armed soldiers from the shadows. They didn't cry. They were too used to the night bringing monsters to their door. Vale spoke slowly, keeping his voice as gentle as a man wearing 60 pounds of tactical gear could manage. "We saw your light," he said. She let out a choked, ragged sob. She reached into the pocket of her oversized faded dress and pulled out a heavy, metallic cylinder. It was an aviation strobe, military grade, the kind stripped from downed supply drones. "Please," she whispered in broken English, her voice cracking. She shoved the strobe toward Vale, not as a weapon, but as an offering. As a plea, my husband, she gasped, pointing frantically at the floorboards beneath their feet. They take him, yesterday, beneath the street. The tunnels, Vale froze. Okoye went entirely still beside him. Tunnels? Vale asked, the blood suddenly roaring in his ears. She nodded violently, tears spilling over her cheeks. For the big trucks. The morning trucks. They make him dig. They put the fire beneath the road. I tried to warn the flying machine. She pointed a trembling finger at the sky. I tried to make the lights so you don't come. And that was when Vale realized the terrible truth. The rooftop they'd been chasing. The tactical high ground they had been so worried about it never existed. They had been looking up, scanning the skyline for a threat that was supposed to rain down on them. They had spent the night dancing across the heights, but the real war, the trap that was waiting to swallow the Dawn convoy and 100 of Vel's brothers and sisters in arms, wasn't in the sky at all. It was right beneath their boots.